500 men. That's what it took. Not 5,000, not 50,000, 500, roughly the population of a small American high school, against an empire that had been building for 2 centuries, that stretched from ocean to ocean, that sacrificed thousands of people a year to keep its gods satisfied. 500 men who had no right to be there, no authorization from their own government, and no way home, because their commander had quietly destroyed every ship that could have taken them back. That's either the most audacious military operation in the history of the human race, or it's one of the great crimes. Maybe it's both. And after 500 years, we still don't have a clean answer. Here's what nobody talks about. Hernán Cortés didn't just conquer a civilization. He did it while being a fugitive from his own country. He was wanted by the governor of Cuba, by the Council of the Indies, by the entire Spanish colonial apparatus. The expedition he led was illegal from day one, and the man who made the whole thing possible wasn't even Spanish. She was a young enslaved woman named Malinche, sold by her own mother, who spoke the language of the gods and the language of the conquerors, and who walked the knife's edge between 2 worlds until one of them ceased to exist. This is that story, and it's stranger, darker, and more complicated than any version you've heard. If this already has you hooked, hit subscribe. We drop new videos every single day, and we are just getting started. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? I'm genuinely curious. Now, let's go back to 1519. Picture the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere. Not Rome, not London, not Paris. A city built on an artificial island in the middle of a lake, connected to the shore by massive stone causeways, wide enough for 10 men to walk side by side. A city with canals in place of roads, with floating gardens growing corn and flowers from the water itself, with a central market where every morning 100,000 people showed up to buy and sell goods from across the continent. A city with pyramids that caught the dawn light and held it until the whole skyline seemed to be on fire. This was Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, home to somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people, making it larger than London, larger than Rome, larger than any city in Spain. When Spanish soldiers first laid eyes on it, the veteran ones, men who had been to Seville, to Lisbon, to Constantinople, went quiet. One of them wrote home that it looked like something out of an enchanted vision, and they couldn't decide if what they were seeing was real. And ruling over all of it was Moctezuma II. You have to understand what kind of power we're talking about. The Aztec Empire, properly called the Triple Alliance, headquartered in Tenochtitlan, controlled between 5 and 6 million people across hundreds of city-states. It ran on a system of tribute that would make an IRS agent blush. Human beings. Subject people sent captives to Tenochtitlan on a regular schedule. Those captives climbed the steps of the Great Pyramid. Their hearts came out. Their bodies rolled down the stairs. And the empire continued. It wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. The Aztecs genuinely believed the world would end without blood. The sun needed feeding. Every year that the sun rose again was a year that someone had paid for it. This theology had a practical side effect. It made the Aztecs enemies of essentially everyone around them. You can build an empire on fear, but fear has a shelf life. By 1519, the map of central Mexico was a pressure cooker. The Aztecs sat at the center, fat on tribute, terrifying, unstoppable, or so it seemed. Around them, dozens of subject peoples who paid their taxes in bodies and resented every single one. Nations like Tlaxcala, which the Aztecs had deliberately kept unconquered, treating them as a nearby farm for sacrificial captives, a practice they called the Flower Wars. Friendly wars, almost. Wars by appointment. You come out, we come out. We take some of yours, you take some of ours. We feed the sun together. The Tlaxcalans did not find this charming. Into this world, this seething, gorgeous, violent world, a boat appeared on the eastern horizon, and then 10 more. And when the boats came ashore, the things that stepped off them were like nothing anyone in the empire had ever seen. Hernán Cortés was 33 years old in 1519. He had been in the New World for 15 years, and he had spent most of that time being a problem for the people around him. Born in Extremadura, a rough, dry province of western Spain that seems to have specialized in producing hungry young men with nothing to lose, he came from minor nobility. His family had lineage, but not money. He was educated enough to read law, ambitious enough to be dangerous, and restless enough that the life of a Spanish farmer was clearly never going to work. So, in 1504, he showed up in the Caribbean, Cuba, Hispaniola, the grinding machinery of early colonial life. He farmed. He did well enough. He became the mayor of a town. He got engaged to a woman and then refused to marry her, which landed him in jail. Twice. He eventually married her. His relationship with the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, yo-yoed between patronage and mutual contempt for years. In 1518, Velázquez gave Cortés command of an expedition to explore the Mexican mainland. Then, at the last moment, he changed his mind. Cortés's ambition was too obvious. His independence was too obvious. Velázquez smelled a rival and tried to yank the commission. Cortés ignored him. He left Cuba before the revocation order could be enforced. He told his men they were going to explore. He had already decided they were going to conquer. And on a February morning in 1519, the fleet put out to sea. 11 ships, roughly 600 soldiers and sailors, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons, headed for a continent where no European had ever really penetrated, to challenge a civilization that had never been challenged. From the moment those ships left the harbor, Cortés was a wanted man. He couldn't go back to Cuba without being arrested. He couldn't fail, because failure meant death. He couldn't turn around, because turning around meant the same thing as failure. He was all in before the first card was dealt, and he knew it. Which is why what he did next, on the shores of Mexico, makes a terrible kind of sense. They landed first in Mayan territory, fought a battle, won it, and received tribute in the form that was customary in this part of the world: gold, food, and women. 20 women, enslaved, given to the Spanish commanders like property, because that's what they were. One of them was named Malinche. She was young. The exact year of her birth is lost, but most historians place it somewhere around the turn of the 16th century, which would have made her a teenager or in her early 20s when Cortés received her as tribute. She had been born to a Nahua noble family somewhere near the Gulf Coast. Her father died when she was young. Her mother remarried, and then her mother did something that would echo through centuries. She sold her daughter into slavery, to Mayan traders probably, some accounts say in exchange for goods, and staged a fake funeral so the neighbors wouldn't know, so the younger brother could inherit without complication. Malinche had been sold before she was given to Cortés. She already knew how to survive among people who didn't care whether she lived or died. She already knew that the only tool she had was the one inside her head: language. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. She spoke Mayan, and within weeks of joining Cortés's camp, she was also learning Spanish. Among all the people on that expedition, she was the only one who could talk to the world they were entering. At first, the translation chain looked like a game of telephone. Cortés would speak Spanish to a priest named Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked in Mayan territory years before and learned the local language. Aguilar would translate to a dialect that Malinche could understand. She would render it into Nahuatl for whoever they were meeting with. Then the whole chain ran in reverse. But Malinche wasn't just a telephone. She was a diplomat, a strategist, a reader of rooms. She understood the politics. She knew the difference between formal court speech and the language of the streets. She could tell when an Aztec lord was lying, and she knew how to make Cortés's demands sound reasonable, or inevitable, which was sometimes better. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, One of the soldiers who was there and later wrote it all down said something that hasn't been forgotten in 5 centuries. Without Doña Marina, he wrote, they could not have understood the language of New Spain and Mexico at all. The Spanish called her Doña Marina. The Aztecs called her Malinche. History knows her La Malinche, and her name became, in modern Mexico, a word for traitor, for someone who betrays their own people to serve a foreign master. It's one of the crueler ironies of this whole story. The woman who was sold by her own people, then used by the Spanish, then discarded, she's the one history handed the bill to. We'll come back to her. She's not done yet. Veracruz, the summer of 1519. The Spanish have been on Mexican soil for a few months. They've established a town, made some alliances, sent a letter and a shipment of Aztec gold to King Charles in Spain. Cortez has technically declared himself directly answerable to the king, cutting out Velázquez entirely, in a legal maneuver so bold, it's almost beautiful. But there's a problem inside the camp. Some of the men are loyal to Velázquez. They've had enough of this insane march into the interior. The city they've heard about sounds impossible. The army they'd be facing sounds insurmountable. And there are ships right there on the beach. Ships that could take them home. Ships that represent the only sane alternative to marching into the unknown heart of a continent. Cortez found out about the conspiracy. Some of the men wanted to steal a ship and sail back to Cuba, warn Velázquez, and let someone else deal with the Aztecs. He had the ringleaders arrested. He had one man's feet cut off. He had others flogged. And then he solved the problem permanently. He ordered the ships stripped. The rigging came down first, then the sails, then everything iron that could be salvaged. The wood, the nails, the anchors, whatever could be carried, carried. And then the hulls were sunk. All of them. 10 ships, gone to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, where pieces of them are still sitting today, waiting for archaeologists to find them. No one called it burning the ships. That detail came later. A painter's embellishment on a tomb in Mexico City 40 years after the fact. The truth was quieter and more methodical. Holes bored through the hull planks in the darkness, the water slowly rising, the ships listing and settling into the shallow water near the shore. Not dramatic, just permanent. Cortez is supposed to have gathered his men and told them something like, "Now you have nothing to go back to. We go forward, or we die." The rhetoric of total commitment. The closing of every exit. Whether he actually said those words or something like them, the math was simple, and everyone could do it. There was no ship. There was no retreat. There was only Tenochtitlan, somewhere inland, over mountains, through jungle, across the heart of an empire that knew they were coming. His men could have killed him. Some of them probably wanted to. Instead, they started walking. The road to Tenochtitlan runs through Tlaxcala, and Tlaxcala was going to be a problem. The Tlaxcalans were one of the most militarily capable nations in central Mexico. They had been fighting the Aztecs, in those choreographed flower wars, for decades. They were not conquered. They were not subjects. They were neighbors who had survived by being fierce enough that the Aztecs kept them around as a convenient blood supply, rather than actually absorbing them. When the Spanish approached Tlaxcalan territory, the Tlaxcalans attacked. For 3 weeks they fought. The Spanish had guns, which were loud and terrifying. They had horses which no one in the Americas had ever seen, and which were so alien to Aztec and Tlaxcalan warfare that early on, fighters thought horse and rider were a single creature, a kind of two-headed, four-legged god. They had steel armor and steel blades that chewed through obsidian weapons like scissors through paper. But the Tlaxcalans had numbers and courage, and they kept coming. The Spanish barely held on. Cortez himself was hit. Men died. The artillery ran low on powder. And still, every morning, more Tlaxcalans. Then something changed. The Tlaxcalan leadership made a calculation. These strangers, these few hundred terrifying, incomprehensible strangers, wanted to fight the Aztecs. The Aztecs, who had been bleeding Tlaxcala for generations, who had taken their sons for sacrifice, who had turned the flower war into a permanent humiliation. The enemy of our enemy, even if that enemy was incomprehensible, was at least useful. The Tlaxcalans called off the war and proposed an alliance. This was the moment that decided everything. Because Cortez didn't just gain allies at Tlaxcala, he gained a template. He saw that the Aztec Empire wasn't some monolithic, unified force. It was a collection of peoples who had been dominated and resented every moment of it. And if you could flip those peoples, if you could turn resentment into rebellion, you didn't have 500 men against millions. You had 500 men and the grievances of a continent. He spent the rest of the march doing exactly that. Every city, every nation he passed through, alliances, promises, and the implicit argument that the age of Aztec supremacy was ending. And the question was only which side of that ending you wanted to be on. By the time Cortez reached the outskirts of Tenochtitlan, he didn't have 500 men. He had a coalition. October 15th, 19, the holy city of Cholula. Cholula was one of the great religious centers of Mesoamerica. Its pyramid, still standing today, the largest pyramid by volume in the world, now with a Spanish church on top of it, which is either poetic or obscene, depending on your point of view, was a pilgrimage site. The city was densely populated, politically complex, and nominally allied with Tenochtitlan. Cortez was welcomed in. Feasts were held. There was talk of escort, of guidance onward. And then Malinche heard something, an old woman in the market. A warning deliberately passed. The welcome was a trap. Moctezuma's warriors were waiting outside the city, and the Cholulans were supposed to keep the Spanish busy until they could be surrounded and destroyed. "Get out now," the woman said. "Or don't. Your choice," Malinche told Cortez. Cortez moved first. He gathered the Cholulan nobles in the central courtyard under the pretense of a farewell ceremony. Then he gave the signal. What followed lasted about 2 hours. When it was over, the courtyard was full of bodies. The Spanish soldiers then went through the city. Thousands of people died in Cholula that day. The exact number is lost to history, but it was enough to send a message that reached Tenochtitlan before any runner could. This is where the story starts to get genuinely complicated. Was it a massacre, unprovoked or almost unprovoked, slaughter of civilians? Or was it a preemptive strike that saved the entire expedition from annihilation? Cortez said it was the second. Aztec accounts called it pure butchery. Modern historians argue about this still. What isn't argued is the effect. The nations between Cholula and Tenochtitlan fell in line very quickly after that. Word traveled fast in this world. Cortez left Cholula and kept marching. November 8th, 1519. Try to feel this moment. You've been marching for months. You've crossed 2 mountain ranges. You've fought a war and made a peace in the same month. You've survived things that should have killed you, and now you're walking down a causeway. Stone beneath your feet, open water on either side, stretching a couple of miles out across a lake, toward a city that your men have been dreaming about and dreading in equal measure since they first heard it described. The causeways into Tenochtitlan were wide enough for 8 horses to walk abreast. On either side of the water, canoes clustered, thousands of them, packed with people who had come to see the strangers arrive. The air smelled of flowers and smoke. The pyramids were visible from miles out, the great temple of the sun cutting against the sky. And walking across the causeway to meet the Spanish was Moctezuma II, carried on a litter, his feet never touching the ground, attended by lords who swept the road before him because the emperor's feet were too sacred to touch anything unclean. He wore sandals with golden soles. He had a headdress of quetzal feathers so elaborate it took 2 men to carry it when it wasn't on his head. He was surrounded by the most powerful men in the hemisphere, and he walked out to meet 500 foreigners. The meeting was described by multiple witnesses on both sides. There are speeches recorded, formal, elaborate, the kind of speech you give when you're performing history for posterity. What Moctezuma actually said, and what it meant, are still debated. The Spanish later claimed he essentially welcomed them as gods, as the fulfillment of a prophecy about the return of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, who was said to have come from the east and would return from the east in a specific year of the Aztec calendar, a year that, as it happened, was 1519. Whether Moctezuma truly believed Cortez was a god, or whether this is a story the Spanish invented later to make their conquest seem more preordained, is one of the great debates of American history. What we know for certain is what he did. He opened the gates. He gave them a palace to stay in. He showed them the city. He didn't attack. And in doing so, he handed Cortez an opening that no amount of artillery or horses could have created. The Spanish walked into Tenochtitlan with their eyes wide open and their mouths hanging open. The soldiers had been told stories. They had heard rumors. But the reality was something else entirely. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who had been to Rome, who had traveled across the Mediterranean, who was by no stretch of the imagination an unsophisticated man, wrote about entering Tenochtitlan in terms that still jump off the page. He called it like something out of a dream, and questioned whether he was awake. The marketplace at Tlatelolco, the merchant district just north of the city center, was the biggest market in the Americas. You could buy anything: cacao, jade, obsidian blades so sharp they made steel knives look blunt, cotton cloth from a dozen different regions, gold dust measured in quill tubes, pottery, medicine, slaves. The noise of it, vendors calling, crowds moving, the low roar of commerce at a scale these Spanish soldiers had never encountered, was audible from a mile away. The zoo was a revelation. Moctezuma kept animals from across his empire: jaguars, pumas, eagles, snakes, strange, flightless birds the Spanish had no words for. There were albinos there too. Human albinos, kept as curiosities, because in a world where albinism was exceptionally rare, they seemed supernatural. The palace had chambers for everything: a room full of weapons, a room full of tribute, gold stacked in the corners, a room full of maps, showing lands the Spanish didn't even know existed. And at the center of all of it, the great temple, rising in steps above the city, its twin shrines at the summit dedicated to the sun and to rain, still smelling of old blood. The sacrificial stones at the top were dark with it. The Spanish were given a tour. Some of them tried to calculate the number of skulls stacked in the rack near the base of the pyramid. They lost count. Cortez looked at all of it and started planning how to take it. For the first weeks, the arrangement was almost polite. Moctezuma hosted. The Spanish admired. There was gift-giving. Extraordinary, almost incomprehensible gift-giving, because in Aztec culture, generosity was a form of power. Moctezuma gave Cortez gold. He gave him jade. He gave him feathers worth more than their weight in silver. He tried to establish the relationship where a great lord gives a lesser visitor gifts, the gifts communicating, "I am so powerful that this means nothing to me." The gold had the exact opposite effect on the Spanish. It excited them beyond reason. Every disc of gold, every piece of jewelry, every golden ornament was proof of what they'd always suspected. This place was unimaginably rich. And the more Moctezuma gave to make them satisfied, the more they wanted. It was a machine with no off switch. Then Cortez received news from the coast that some of his men, stationed with the Totonac allies near Veracruz, had been killed by Aztec warriors. The unspoken truce, "You stay in your corner, I'll stay in mine," had been broken. Cortez made his move. He went to see Moctezuma. He was polite, elaborate, through Malinche, through the whole careful translation chain. He said there had been an incident. He said it was regrettable. He said the only way to prevent further misunderstanding was for Moctezuma to come stay with him, in the Spanish quarters, as a guest, until matters could be sorted out. It wasn't a request. Moctezuma's advisors urged him to refuse. Some of them reportedly urged him to give the signal to attack. The Spanish were deep inside the city, surrounded on all sides, cut off from any retreat. A word from the emperor, and they'd be dead within the hour. But Moctezuma hesitated. Whether from calculation, from fear, from genuine theological confusion about what these strangers were, he went with them. The most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere walked into a Spanish-held palace as a captive, and with him went, in a very real sense, the empire itself. For months it worked. Moctezuma still held court. He still issued decrees. He still received tribute. But the decrees now reflected what Cortez wanted. The tribute now flowed, partly, into Spanish pockets. Cortez sat behind the throne and pulled the strings, and the empire kept running, because everyone pretended the emperor was free. But the Aztec people were not stupid, and they were watching. They saw their emperor bow to strangers. They saw the strangers tear down idols and put up crosses. They saw the gold being melted down, their sacred objects, their artistic masterworks, their centuries of accumulated craft, being turned into ingots by Spanish smelters who cared nothing for what it had looked like before. They saw all of this, and their patience corroded, slowly, like iron in salt water. Then, in the spring of 1520, everything broke. Cortez received word that a large Spanish force had landed on the coast. 19 ships, 1,400 soldiers, sent by Velázquez to arrest him. His personal crisis, the legal reckoning he'd been dodging since he first sailed from Cuba, had finally caught up with him. He made a decision that, in retrospect, seems insane. He left Tenochtitlan. He took most of his forces and marched to the coast to deal with the rival Spanish army, leaving his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge with a skeleton garrison. Alvarado was brave. He was loyal. He was also, by every account, deeply susceptible to panic. May 22nd, 1520. In the great temple of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were celebrating the Toxcatl festival, one of the most sacred ceremonies of their calendar year. Hundreds of nobles and priests had gathered in the temple courtyard, dressed in their finest. The drums were going, the singing had started, the ritual dancing was underway. Alvarado received a report, or believed he received one, that this gathering was cover for a revolt, that the drums were a signal, that the nobles were armed beneath their regalia, that when the ceremony ended, the Spanish garrison would be surrounded and killed. Whether this was true, false, or somewhere in between is still debated. What isn't debated is what Alvarado did. He sealed the temple courtyard. His soldiers blocked every exit, the gates, the stairs, the passages, and then they attacked. The people in the courtyard were unarmed, or very nearly so, because they had promised to hold the ceremony peacefully. They had nothing to fight with but their hands. The Spanish had steel. The killing took about an hour. When it was over, the courtyard was full of bodies. Nobles, priests, musicians, dancers, bystanders. The blood ran down the temple steps in the same channels that had always carried it. Only this time it wasn't sacrificed captives, but Tenochtitlan's own elite. Word spread through the city in minutes. Tenochtitlan rose. The Spanish garrison barricaded themselves inside the palace. Outside, tens of thousands of Aztec warriors surrounded them. Stones, arrows, burning projectiles. The Spanish fired back. The siege began. Moctezuma, still technically captive, was pushed out onto a rooftop to calm his people, to tell them to stand down. They threw stones at him, their own emperor. That's how completely things had broken. Cortez, 300 miles away, got the news. He'd won his battle against Velázquez's army, absorbed most of their soldiers into his own force, and was already marching back. He came back to a city at war with him. He tried to fix it. He ordered Moctezuma to speak again. It didn't matter. Moctezuma was dead within days, and whether the Spanish killed him quietly, or the Aztec mob's stones finished what they started, is one of those historical questions that may never be answered. The Aztecs had already elected a new emperor, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, who had been arguing for war from the beginning. Cuitlahuac had no interest in negotiation. For a week, the Spanish held the palace. They were running out of food, out of water, out of powder. Cortez had barely escaped being killed on the march back in. The city that had once welcomed them like gods now wanted to tear them apart. Every hour that passed, their situation got worse. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortez made his decision. They were leaving. Tonight. Under cover of the rain that had just started to fall. No drums, no announcements, no ceremony. Just pick up everything you can carry and move, very quietly, toward the Western Causeway. He told his men to take gold, whatever they could manage. He had the royal treasury stripped. Moctezuma's gold, the tribute gold, the hoarded wealth of the empire, melted down, portioned out, carried. Some men stuffed their clothes with it. Some soldiers loaded themselves down until they could barely walk. The veterans, the ones who'd been in enough fights, took a little and left the rest. They knew what extra weight meant on a narrow causeway over dark water, with an enemy that could come from any direction. They wrapped the horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound. They built a portable bridge to lay across the gaps in the causeway, where the Aztecs had pulled up sections to block escape. They moved out of the palace at midnight, into the rain. For a few minutes, it seemed to be working. They crossed the first canal, the second. The portable bridge did its job, and then, before they reached the third crossing, a woman was drawing water at the edge of the canal. She looked up, she saw them, and she screamed. From the top of the temple, the great pyramid they had toured with Moctezuma months ago, the pyramid whose steps they had climbed and whose shrine they had tried to replace with a cross, a priest began to sound the alarm. The drums started, and across the dark water of the lake, the Aztec warriors who had been waiting, who had half expected exactly this, began to move. The canoes came first, hundreds of them, in the dark, in the rain, coming from every direction. Soldiers with spears and obsidian blades appeared on the causeway ahead and behind. The portable bridge, jammed in the first gap, couldn't be moved. Too many bodies had fallen across it. Too many men and horses and tons of gold had crossed it, and it was stuck. The Spaniards behind the bridge couldn't cross. The men ahead couldn't go back. The causeway became a disaster. Men fell into the water. Some jumped deliberately, trying to swim. Many of them were wearing armor. Many of them had filled their pockets with gold. The water at Tenochtitlan's edge was not deep, maybe 10 feet. But 10 feet in steel armor with your pockets full of gold ingots is fatal. They drowned by the dozens. Some drowned on the bodies of the men who drowned before them. The water too shallow for the fall to kill, and too deep for the weight to let them rise. The horses panicked. Several were pulled from the causeway into the canoes. The artillery, the cannons that had terrified every army from the coast to the capital, sank. The powder was soaked and useless anyway. Cortez himself fought his way to the front. He was hit. He kept moving. He pulled men out of the water with his own hands, by some accounts. He rallied. He attacked the warriors blocking the causeway ahead with everything he had, buying space, buying time. By the time he reached the far shore, the mainland, solid ground, safety, he turned around to count who was left. Roughly half his Spanish force was gone. Dead, drowned, captured. Thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies were gone. All the gold, all the artillery, most of the horses. The treasure of an empire, sitting at the bottom of a lake where pieces of it are still occasionally dug up today, including, in 1981, a gold bar from a construction site in Mexico City, later analyzed and confirmed to be from Aztec smelters, approximately 1520. Cortez found a tree by the road. He sat down under it, and he wept. The soldiers who were there later recorded it. They called it La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. And they recorded that their commander, the man who had sunk his own ships, who had marched into the heart of an empire as a fugitive, who had held a civilization hostage. That man sat under a tree on a rainy night in Mexico and cried. Some historians have called this performance, Cortez understood the power of visible emotion, understood that a commander weeping for his men built loyalty. Others have called it genuine, the first honest moment of the whole campaign, the cracking of a mask he'd been wearing since Cuba. What's true is probably both, and neither. Cortez was complicated that way. But then he stood up. He looked back toward Tenochtitlan, invisible behind him in the dark and rain, and he started planning how to go back.